The afternoon sun was beating down on Highway 52 when Officer Blake Henderson spotted the blue Honda Civic going 15 miles over the speed limit. He flicked on his lights and pulled the car over near the old oak trees that lined the road. As he walked up to the driver's side window, he could see a young black girl behind the wheel, maybe 16 or 17 years old. Her hands were shaking a little bit as she rolled down the window. "Good afternoon, miss. Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Officer Henderson asked, adjusting his sunglasses as he looked down at the teenager. The girl took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, sir, I was speeding. I'm really sorry about that. I was trying to get to Lincoln Middle School to pick up my little brother before they closed the after-school program." Her voice was polite and respectful, just like her parents had taught her. "License and registration, please," the officer said, watching as the girl fumbled through her purse with nervous fingers. The car was clean but old, probably had about 150,000 miles on it. The seats had a few small tears, and there was a crack in the dashboard from years of sun exposure. "Here you go, sir," she said, handing over her documents. Her name was Destiny Jackson, and she'd just gotten her license 3 months ago. This was actually the first time she'd ever been pulled over, and her heart was pounding so hard she thought the officer might hear it. Officer Henderson looked at the license, then back at the girl. "Destiny Jackson, huh? You live over on Pine Street?" "Yes, sir, with my dad and my little brother Tyler. Tyler's only 8, and he gets worried when nobody shows up to get him. That's why I was driving a little too fast. I didn't mean any disrespect to the law or anything." The officer had been doing this job for 12 years, and he'd heard every excuse in the book. Kids always had some story about why they were speeding, why they ran that red light, why they didn't come to a complete stop. Most of the time, it was just teenagers trying to get out of trouble. "Where's your mom?" he asked, looking around the car. "She know you're driving around town?" Destiny's face got a little sad. "My mom passed away when I was 10, sir. It's just me and my dad and Tyler now. My dad works really hard to take care of us." Officer Henderson softened a tiny bit. Single-parent households were tough, especially when the parent was trying to raise kids on their own. "What kind of work does your dad do?" "He's in the military, sir. He's been serving our country for over 20 years now. He always tells us to respect police officers and follow all the rules, which is why I'm being honest with you about the speeding." The officer looked at the girl again, taking in her simple clothes and the worn-out car. He'd grown up in this town, and he knew most of the military families. The big shots usually lived over in the nicer neighborhoods and drove newer cars. Their kids went to the private schools and had credit cards from their parents. "Military. Huh?" Officer Henderson said with a small smile. "What branch? Army Reserve? National Guard?" "No, sir. Regular Army. He's a colonel, and he's done lots of deployments overseas. He just got back from his last one about 6 months ago." Destiny spoke with obvious pride in her voice when she talked about her father. Officer Henderson couldn't help but chuckle a little bit. "A colonel? Really?" He looked at the old car again, then back at the girl's simple t-shirt and jeans. "Let me guess. He's some kind of special forces guy too, right? Maybe a Navy SEAL?" "Actually, he's Army Special Forces, sir. The Green Berets." Destiny said it quietly, but her voice was steady. She could tell the officer didn't believe her, and it made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The chuckle turned into a bigger laugh. "Green Berets? Come on now, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I've been a cop for 12 years, kid. I know what military families look like around here, and I know what kind of cars they drive." Destiny felt her face getting hot, but She kept her voice respectful. "I understand why you might not believe me, sir, but I'm telling the truth. My dad always taught me to be honest, especially with police officers." "Look, I get it. You want to make your dad sound important, so maybe I'll go easy on you. But making up stories isn't going to help your case here." Officer Henderson was still smiling, but it wasn't a nice smile anymore. "If your dad's really some big-shot colonel, where's the fancy house? Where's the new car? Why are you wearing clothes from Walmart?" The words stung, and Destiny had to blink back tears. She'd heard comments like this before, at school and other places. People always seemed surprised when she told them about her father's job. They expected military officers to look a certain way, live in certain neighborhoods, spend money on certain things. "My dad doesn't care about fancy stuff, sir. He says, the important thing is taking care of family and serving your country, not showing off." Her voice was still polite, but there was a little bit of steel in it now. Officer Henderson shook his head and walked back toward his patrol car. "Just sit tight while I run your information, okay? And next time, maybe stick to stories that people might actually believe." As he sat in his police car running Destiny's license through the computer, Officer Henderson was still chuckling to himself. Green Berets, Special Forces Colonel, these kids and their imaginations. He'd bet money that her dad worked at the factory, or maybe did some weekend warrior stuff with the National Guard. Nothing wrong with that. But why make up fairy tales? The computer showed that Destiny had a clean record. No tickets, no arrests, nothing. She was a good student at Roosevelt High School, honor roll for the past 2 years. But that didn't change the fact that she was speeding and making up stories about her family. Back in the Honda Civic, Destiny was trying not to cry. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her father. "Got pulled over on Highway 52. I was speeding to get Tyler. Officer doesn't believe you're military. I'm being respectful like you taught me." The response came back almost immediately. "Stay calm, baby girl. Tell the truth and be polite. I'm heading your way now. Love you." Officer Henderson was taking his time with the paperwork. In his experience, making people wait a little bit helped them think about their actions. Maybe next time this girl would think twice before speeding around town and making up stories about her family. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Destiny sitting quietly in her car, looking straight ahead. She wasn't on her phone, wasn't fidgeting around, wasn't doing any of the stuff that most teenagers did when they got pulled over. She was just sitting there, hands folded in her lap, waiting patiently. That was a little unusual, actually. Most kids her age would be texting their friends, posting on social media about getting pulled over, maybe even crying or arguing. This girl was just waiting, calm and respectful, like she'd been trained for this kind of situation. Officer Henderson's radio crackled to life. "Unit 23, this is dispatch. Everything okay out there? You've been stopped for quite a while?" "Yeah, everything's fine," he replied. "Just dealing with a teenager who thinks her daddy's Rambo. Should be wrapped up here in a few minutes." But something was nagging at him. The girl's calm behavior, the way she spoke, the respect in her voice even when he was clearly not believing her story. It reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. He decided to write her a ticket for speeding. Maybe that would teach her a lesson about both following traffic laws and telling the truth. As he started filling out the citation, his radio crackled again. "Unit 23, be advised we have a concerned parent en route to your location. ETA about 3 minutes. Officer Henderson sighed. Great. Now he'd have to deal with an angry parent on top of everything else. Probably some factory worker who was going to yell at him for picking on his kid. This was turning into more of a hassle than a simple speeding ticket should be. He looked up from his paperwork and saw a black pickup truck slowing down across the street. The truck had several military stickers on it, and as it parked, Officer Henderson could see that whoever was driving had backup lights and seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who immediately caught the officer's attention. Even in civilian clothes, there was something about the way this guy carried himself that made Officer Henderson sit up straighter in his patrol car. The man was tall, probably in his early 40s, with graying hair cut short and neat. But it wasn't his appearance that was striking. It was the way he moved, the way he held himself, the way he seemed to take in everything around him with just a quick glance. Officer Henderson had seen that kind of bearing before, and it definitely wasn't from any factory worker. This was going to be interesting. The man who stepped out of the black pickup truck moved with the kind of purpose that made people notice. Colonel David Jackson had been in enough tense situations to know when things weren't going the way they should. His daughter's text message had told him everything he needed to know. And now, seeing the police car still parked behind her Honda with the officer taking his sweet time, his jaw tightened just a little bit. Officer Henderson watched through his rearview mirror as the man approached. There was something about the way this guy walked that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was the kind of confidence that came from someone who'd been in charge of serious situations before. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay back while I finish up here," Officer Henderson called out as he finally got out of his patrol car. He'd decided to drag this traffic stop out long enough, and now he had to deal with what he assumed was an overprotective parent. Colonel Jackson stopped about 10 feet away, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. "Officer, I'm Colonel David Jackson. That's my daughter you've got pulled over there." His voice was calm, but carried the kind of authority that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "Uh-huh," Officer Henderson said, looking the man up and down. The guy was wearing jeans and a plain blue t-shirt, nothing fancy. But something about him was making the officer feel off balance. "Well, your daughter was speeding, and she's been telling me some pretty interesting stories about your job." "What kind of stories?" Colonel Jackson asked. His voice stayed level, but his eyes had gone very still in a way that people who knew him would recognize as a warning sign. Officer Henderson felt like he was being studied, and he didn't like it. "She claims you're some kind of special forces." "Colonel, Green Berets," she said. He tried to put the same mocking tone in his voice that he'd used with Destiny, but somehow it didn't come out quite right. "I see." Colonel Jackson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them. "And you found that amusing?" Before Officer Henderson could answer, another patrol car pulled up. Officer Lisa Rodriguez got out and walked over, her eyes taking in the scene quickly. Lisa was a 10-year veteran of the force and also a former Marine. She'd learned to read situations fast, and right now her instincts were telling her that something was not quite right about this traffic. "Stop! Everything okay here, Blake?" she asked her fellow officer, but her eyes kept drifting back to the man in civilian clothes who somehow managed to look more military than half the guys she'd served with. "Just a routine traffic stop," Officer Henderson replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The girl was speeding, and now Daddy's here to try and get her out of trouble." Lisa looked at Colonel Jackson again, taking in details that her partner had missed. The way he stood, the haircut, the fact that his clothes were neat and pressed, even though they were casual. The pickup truck behind him had base stickers that looked legitimate, not the kind of fake military stuff that wannabes sometimes put on their cars. "Sir, were you military?" Lisa asked directly. I am military, Colonel Jackson corrected gently. Active duty, 22 years. And you? Marines, 6 years before I became a cop. Lisa's whole demeanor had changed, and Officer Henderson was starting to feel like he was missing something important. Semper Fi, Colonel Jackson said with the first hint of a smile he'd shown since arriving. Hoo-ah, Lisa responded automatically, using the Army greeting. She turned to her partner. Blake, maybe we should wrap this up pretty quick. I've got a feeling we're dealing with the real deal here. But Officer Henderson was in too deep now to back down gracefully. He'd spent the last 20 minutes making jokes about this family, and admitting he was wrong would be embarrassing. Look, I don't care if this guy spent a weekend at boot camp or whatever. His daughter was breaking the law, and she tried to use her daddy's supposed military service to get out of trouble. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. Colonel Jackson's eyes went completely flat, the way they did when he was deciding how to handle a situation that had just crossed a line. Officer Henderson, he said, reading the name tag. My daughter was raised to tell the truth, especially to law enforcement. When she told you about my service, she wasn't making excuses. She was answering your question honestly. Right, Henderson said, but his voice was starting to sound less sure. And I suppose you've got some kind of proof of this big, important military career? Before Colonel Jackson could respond, Lisa stepped in. Blake, what's gotten into you? You're being way more aggressive than usual. She'd never seen her partner act like this before, and it was making her uncomfortable. I'm just tired of people thinking they can lie their way out of tickets, Henderson replied, but even he was starting to realize he might have made a mistake. The problem was, he'd gone too far to turn back now without looking like a complete fool. Colonel Jackson reached slowly into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed Officer Henderson a military ID card without saying a word. Henderson looked at the card and his face went pale. The ID was definitely real, with all the right security features and official seals, and the rank listed was exactly what? The girl had said, Lieutenant Colonel, which was just one step below full colonel. This could be fake, Henderson said weakly, but he was grasping at straws now. Lisa took the ID from her partner and examined it carefully. As a former Marine, she knew what to look for in military identification. Blake, this is absolutely legitimate. And if this is fake, it's better than anything I've ever seen. Officer Henderson felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. He looked back at Destiny, who was still sitting patiently in her car, and then at her father, who was watching him with those steady, unblinking eyes. Even if it's real, Henderson said, his voice getting defensive, that doesn't give them special treatment. Everyone has to follow the law. You're absolutely right, Colonel Jackson agreed. Everyone should follow the law, and everyone should be treated with respect while you enforce it. My daughter broke the speed limit, and she's ready to accept the consequences. But she didn't deserve to be mocked for telling the truth about her family. The radio in Officer Henderson's car crackled to life. Unit 23, this is Sergeant Williams. I need you to wrap up that traffic stop and head to the community center. We've got a situation there that needs attention. Lisa walked over and picked up the radio. Sergeant Williams, this is Unit 47. I'm on scene with Henderson. You might want to come take a look at this situation yourself. Copy that. On my way. Colonel Jackson checked his watch. Officer, my son gets out of his after-school program in 15 minutes. My daughter was trying to be responsible by picking him up on time. She made a mistake by speeding, and she's prepared to accept whatever citation you think is appropriate. But I'd appreciate it if we could resolve this quickly so she can take care of her family responsibilities. Officer Henderson was trapped. He'd written himself into a corner by being so dismissive and mocking, and now he was facing the reality that he'd been completely wrong about this family. The father wasn't some factory worker trying to impress people with fake military stories. He was exactly what his daughter had said he was. "I need to finish running her information," Henderson said, grasping for time to figure out how to get out of this mess gracefully. "You ran her information 20 minutes ago," Lisa pointed out. "I heard you on the radio." The sound of another police car approaching made everyone look up. Sergeant Williams was pulling into the scene, and Officer Henderson felt his stomach drop. Sergeant Williams was a 25-year veteran of the force and a former Army Ranger. If anyone would be able to spot a real military officer, it would be him. As the sergeant got out of his car and approached the group, Colonel Jackson straightened up slightly. It was an automatic response, the kind of thing that happened when military people encountered someone they recognized as being in a position of authority. Sergeant Williams took one look at Colonel Jackson and stopped in his tracks. His eyes went wide, and suddenly he was standing at attention. "Colonel Jackson? Sir, is that you?" Officer Henderson felt like he was going to be sick. This was getting worse by the minute. "Hello, Tony," Colonel Jackson said with a genuine smile. "Good to see you again." "Sir, what are you doing here?" Sergeant Williams asked, clearly confused about why a decorated Special Forces officer was standing on the side of Highway 52 during a traffic stop. "My daughter was pulled over for speeding," Colonel Jackson explained. "Officer Henderson here has been handling the situation." Sergeant Williams looked at Officer Henderson, then back at Colonel Jackson, and suddenly understood exactly what had happened. His face went very serious, the way it did when he was about to have a conversation that nobody was going to enjoy. Sergeant Tony Williams couldn't believe what he was seeing. Standing right there on Highway 52, in jeans and a t-shirt, was one of the most decorated soldiers he'd ever had the honor of serving with. Colonel David Jackson looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago when their paths had crossed during a joint training exercise at Fort Bragg. "Sir, I had no idea you were stationed in this area," Sergeant Williams said, still maintaining the respectful posture that came automatically when addressing a superior officer, even out of uniform. "We moved here about 8 months ago when I got reassigned to the training command at Fort Stewart," Colonel Jackson replied. "My kids needed stability after bouncing around different bases for years." Officer Henderson was watching this exchange with growing horror. The way his sergeant was acting around this man made it crystal clear that he wasn't dealing with some weekend warrior or wannabe soldier. Sergeant Williams had been his mentor for the past 5 years, and Henderson had never seen him show this level of respect to anyone. "Blake," Sergeant Williams said, turning to face Officer Henderson with an expression that made the younger officer's blood run cold. "What exactly has been happening here?" "Well, sir, I pulled over the girl for speeding," Henderson began, his voice shaky. "She was going 15 over the limit, and when I asked her about it, she started making up stories about her father being some kind of Special Forces colonel." Colonel Jackson's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, letting Henderson dig his own grave. "Making up stories?" Sergeant Williams repeated slowly. "Officer Henderson, do you have any idea who you're talking about?" "I mean, I see now that he's actually military." Henderson backtracked quickly. "But the girl was clearly exaggerating about his rank and service record to try and get out of trouble." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Actually, Blake, she wasn't exaggerating about anything. I've seen his military ID, and everything checks out exactly like she said." Sergeant Williams looked back and forth between his officers and Colonel Jackson. "Sir, would you mind if I asked what my officer here said to you and your daughter?" "He laughed when she mentioned my military service," Colonel Jackson said calmly. He suggested she was making up fairy tales and asked why we don't have a fancy house and new car if I'm really a colonel. He seemed to think my daughter was lying to impress him. The color drained completely from Sergeant Williams' face. In all his years as a police supervisor, he'd never been more embarrassed by one of his officers' behavior. "Colonel Jackson, sir, I am deeply sorry about this situation." "Tony, there's no need for you to apologize for something you didn't do," Colonel Jackson said. "But I think this might be a good learning opportunity for Officer Henderson here." Henderson was starting to sweat despite the cool afternoon air. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? I'm sorry if I was wrong about your military service." "You weren't wrong about my military service," Colonel Jackson corrected. "You were wrong about making assumptions based on what someone looks like or how much money they appear to have." Sergeant Williams nodded grimly. "Colonel, would you mind if I shared a little bit about your service record with my officers? I think it might help them understand the gravity of this situation." Colonel Jackson hesitated. "I don't usually talk about my deployments, Tony. You know how it is." "Sir, I think in this case it might be important," Williams pressed gently. Officer Rodriguez was watching the exchange with growing curiosity. As a former Marine, she could tell that there was something significant about Colonel Jackson that went beyond just his rank. The way Sergeant Williams was treating him suggested someone with a distinguished combat record. "Colonel Jackson served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq," Sergeant Williams began. "He's been awarded the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, with V devices for valor and 2 Purple Hearts. He's led some of the most dangerous special operations missions our military has conducted in the past decade." Henderson felt like he was going to throw up. The Silver Star was one of the highest decorations for combat bravery, just below the Medal of Honor. This wasn't just some career officer pushing papers around. This was a genuine war hero. "The last time I saw the colonel," Williams continued, "he was recovering from an IED blast that should have killed him and 3 of his men. Instead, he carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire before allowing medics to treat his own injuries." Colonel Jackson looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Tony, that's enough. Ancient history." "No, sir. With respect, it's not ancient history," Williams replied firmly. "It's exactly the kind of service that our community should know about and respect." Officer Henderson was beginning to understand just how badly he'd messed up. This wasn't just about making a mistake with a traffic stop. He'd insulted and mocked a genuine American hero and his family based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions. "Officer Henderson," Colonel Jackson said, addressing him directly, "what bothers me most about this situation isn't that you questioned my service record. It's that you treated my daughter with disrespect because you decided we didn't. Look like we belonged in whatever category you think military families should fit into." "Sir, I really am sorry," Henderson said, and for the first time, he actually meant it. "I was completely out of line. My daughter has been raised to respect law enforcement," Colonel Jackson continued. "She's been taught that police officers put their lives on the line every day to protect our communities. When she told you about my military service, she wasn't bragging or trying to get special treatment. She was sharing something she's proud of because I taught her to be proud of service to our country." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Henderson. "Blake, what were you thinking? Even if you didn't believe her story, there was no reason to be dismissive and rude." Henderson looked over at Destiny, who was still sitting quietly in her car. She hadn't gotten out, hadn't argued, hadn't caused any drama. She just sat there patiently while her father handled the situation with the same calm professionalism he probably brought to every difficult situation he encountered. "The thing is," Colonel Jackson said, My daughter doesn't need my rank or my service record to deserve respectful treatment from law enforcement. Every citizen you encounter deserves that basic level of dignity, regardless of their background or what their family members do for a living. Sergeant Williams was taking mental notes for the conversation he was going to have with Henderson later. Colonel, you're absolutely right. This kind of behavior is not acceptable from any officer under my command. I appreciate that, Tony, Colonel Jackson replied. But I'm more interested in making sure this becomes a learning experience than I am in getting anyone in trouble. Another car was approaching the scene. Officer Rodriguez looked up and groaned internally. "That's Captain Murphy," she said quietly. The police captain arriving on scene meant that this situation was about to get even more complicated. Captain Murphy got out of his car and surveyed the scene. 3 police cars, 1 civilian truck, and what looked like a very serious conversation happening between several officers and a man in civilian clothes. This definitely wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. "Sergeant Williams, what's the situation here?" Captain Murphy asked as he approached the group. "Captain, we have a bit of a situation," Williams replied carefully. "One of our officers pulled over Colonel Jackson's daughter for speeding, and there have been some complications with how the stop was handled." Captain Murphy looked at Colonel Jackson, taking in the same military bearing that everyone else had noticed. "Colonel Jackson, are you the David Jackson who spoke at our community relations meeting last month?" Henderson's stomach dropped even further. The colonel had been involved with the police department's community outreach programs? This was getting worse by the minute. "That's right, Captain," Colonel Jackson confirmed. "I've been working with your community relations team on some youth mentorship programs." "Outstanding," Captain Murphy said with genuine enthusiasm. "Your presentation about leadership and service really impressed our community partners." He paused and looked around at the assembled officers. "So what seems to be the problem here?" Sergeant Williams cleared his throat. "Officer Henderson made some inappropriate comments during the traffic stop. He questioned the colonel's military service and suggested that his daughter was lying about her father's background." Captain Murphy's expression went very serious very quickly. "Is that so?" He looked directly at Henderson, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool weather. "Sir, I made some mistakes," Henderson admitted. "I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I was disrespectful to both the colonel and his daughter." "Officer Henderson," Captain Murphy said in a tone that suggested this conversation was far from over, "we'll be discussing this situation in detail back at the station. For now, I think we need to resolve this traffic stop and allow Colonel Jackson and his daughter to get on with their day." Colonel Jackson checked his watch again. "Actually, Captain, if we could wrap this up soon, I'd appreciate it. My son will be wondering where his sister is." The mention of the 8-year-old boy waiting at school seemed to snap everyone back to reality. This had started as a simple speeding ticket and had turned into a major incident involving multiple supervisors and a decorated war veteran. "Officer Henderson," Sergeant Williams said firmly, "I think you have some paperwork to finish up." Officer Henderson walked back to his patrol car with shaky legs, feeling like the world had turned upside down in the past 30 minutes. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his citation book, knowing that every eye was on him. Sergeant Williams, Officer Rodriguez, Captain Murphy, and Colonel Jackson were all watching to see how he would handle the next few minutes. The weight of his mistakes was crushing down on him. This wasn't just about writing a speeding ticket anymore. This was about everything he thought he knew about people, about assumptions, about the way he'd been doing his job for the past 12 years. Colonel Jackson approached Henderson's patrol, Carr moving with that same calm confidence he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. "Officer Henderson, may I have a word with you?" Henderson looked up from his paperwork, expecting anger or demands for an apology. Instead, he saw something he didn't expect in the colonel's eyes. It wasn't fury or contempt. It was disappointment mixed with something that almost looked like concern. "Sir, I know I messed up really bad," Henderson began, but Colonel Jackson held up a hand. "Let me ask you something," the colonel said quietly, leaning against the patrol car. "Do you have kids?" The question caught Henderson off guard. "Yes, sir. 2 daughters, ages 12 and 14. And if one of your daughters was pulled over by a police officer, how would you want that officer to treat her?" Henderson thought about his own girls, imagining them nervous and scared during their first traffic stop. "I'd want the officer to be fair but respectful, professional." "Even if your daughter made a mistake? Even if she was speeding?" "Yes, sir. Especially then. Kids make mistakes, but they don't deserve to be treated badly because of it." Colonel Jackson nodded slowly. "My daughter Destiny has never been in trouble with the law. She's an honor student, volunteers at the local animal shelter, and helps take care of her 8-year-old brother while I'm working. When she told you about my military service, she wasn't trying to get out of trouble or impress you. She was nervous and trying to explain why she was rushing." Henderson felt his throat tighten. "Sir, I realize now that I was completely wrong about everything." "You weren't wrong about the speeding," Colonel Jackson pointed out. "She was going 15, over the limit, and that's not okay. What was wrong was assuming that she was lying about her family based on what we looked like or what kind of car we drove." Captain Murphy had been listening to the conversation from a few feet away. He stepped closer, his expression serious but not angry. "Officer Henderson, this situation has highlighted some serious issues that we need to address." "Yes, sir. I understand," Henderson replied, knowing that his career was probably about to change dramatically. "But before we talk about consequences," Captain Murphy continued, "I want to understand what happened here. You've been a decent officer for 12 years. You've never had any complaints about treating people unfairly. So what went wrong today?" Henderson was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. "I guess I've always had ideas in my head about what different kinds of people should look like. Military officers, especially high-ranking ones, should drive nice cars and live in expensive neighborhoods. Their kids should go to private schools and wear designer clothes. And when Destiny didn't fit that picture," Colonel Jackson asked, "I just assumed she was making it up. I thought she was some kid from a working-class family trying to sound important." Henderson's voice was barely above a whisper. "I never stopped to think that maybe my picture was wrong." Officer Rodriguez joined the conversation. "Blake, I served with officers from all kinds of backgrounds. Some of the best leaders I knew drove beat-up trucks and lived in regular neighborhoods because they cared more about their mission than showing off. My family lives simply because that's how I choose to spend my money," Colonel Jackson explained. "I'd rather put money aside for my kids' college education than buy a fancy car. I'd rather live in a neighborhood where my children can ride their day bikes safely than worry about impressing people I don't even know." Sergeant Williams approached the group, carrying a folder. "Colonel Jackson, I've been looking over your community involvement with our department. You've been volunteering with our youth programs for 8 months, mentoring at-risk teenagers and speaking to school groups about leadership and service." Henderson's face went even paler. Not only had he insulted a decorated war hero, but he'd insulted someone who was actively working to help kids in their community. "Those programs mean a lot to me," Colonel Jackson said. I've seen what happens when young people don't have positive role models or when they feel like society has written them off based on where they come from or what they look like. "Sir," Henderson said, finding his voice again, "is there anything I can do to make this right? I know I can't take back what I said, but I want to learn from this." Colonel Jackson studied Henderson for a moment. "You know what would mean the most to me? If you used this experience to become a better officer. If you took the time to really think about the assumptions you make about people before you interact with them." Captain Murphy nodded. "Officer Henderson, you're going to be attending some additional training on community relations and cultural sensitivity. You're also going to be partnering with Officer Rodriguez for the next 3 months so you can learn from someone who understands what respectful policing looks like." "I'd be honored to work with Officer Rodriguez," Henderson said, meaning it. "And," Captain Murphy continued, "you're going to volunteer 20 hours with our community youth programs. Maybe spending some time with kids from different backgrounds will help you understand that families come in all shapes and sizes." Colonel Jackson smiled for the first time since the whole situation began. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Captain. I'd be happy to help Officer Henderson get connected with those programs." Henderson looked surprised. "Sir, after everything I said today, you'd still be willing to help me?" "Officer Henderson, I've been leading soldiers for over 20 years. I've learned that people can change when they're given the opportunity and the right guidance. The question is whether you're willing to do the work." "Yes, sir, I am. I promise I am." Colonel Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "This has my contact information for the Youth Mentorship Program. When you're ready to start your volunteer hours, give me a call." Henderson took the card with hands that were no longer shaking. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "Don't do it for me," Colonel Jackson said. "Do it for the next family you pull over. Do it for your own daughters. Do it because being a police officer is about serving all members of your community with equal respect and dignity." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Blake, I want you to think about something. Every person you encounter during a traffic stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's sibling. They all deserve to be treated like human beings, regardless of what assumptions you might make about their background." Sergeant Williams had been writing notes throughout the conversation. "Officer Henderson, we're going to have a formal discussion about this incident back at the station. But I want you to know that I see this as an opportunity for growth, not just a disciplinary action." "I appreciate that, Sergeant. I really do." Captain Murphy checked his watch. "Colonel Jackson, we've taken up enough of your time. I believe Officer Henderson has some paperwork to finish so you and your daughter can get on with your day." Henderson walked back to his patrol car and quickly finished writing up the traffic citation. But instead of a ticket for speeding, he wrote Destiny a warning. When he handed it to her through her car window, he looked her directly in the eyes. "Miss Jackson, I owe you an apology. You were respectful and honest throughout this entire stop, and I failed to treat you with the same respect. I'm sorry." Destiny looked at the warning, then back at Officer Henderson. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate that. Drive safely and tell your little brother I said hello." As Destiny drove away to pick up Tyler from school, Colonel Jackson shook hands with each of the officers. "Gentlemen, Officer Rodriguez, thank you for handling this situation professionally. Colonel, thank you for your patience and your service," Captain Murphy replied, "both to our country and to our community." 3 months later, Officer Henderson was working his regular patrol when he spotted a familiar black pickup truck at the community center. Inside, he could see Colonel Jackson speaking to a group of teenagers about leadership and making good choices. Henderson had completed his 20 hours of community service and discovered something he never expected. He actually enjoyed working with young people, especially kids who reminded him of his own daughters. The experience had changed not just how he did his job, but how he saw the world around him. When the presentation was over, Henderson approached Colonel Jackson in the parking lot. "Colonel, I wanted to thank you again for giving me a second chance. How are things going, Officer Henderson?" "Better than I expected, sir. Working with Officer Rodriguez has taught me a lot, and the community programs have opened my eyes to perspectives I never considered before." Colonel Jackson smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. Real change takes time and effort, but it's always worth it." As they talked, Destiny walked out of the community center where she'd been helping with the youth program. She recognized Officer Henderson immediately and walked over. "Officer Henderson, how are you doing?" "I'm doing well, Destiny. How's school going?" "Great. I'm actually planning to study criminal justice in college. I want to work in community policing, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve." Henderson felt a lump form in his throat. This young woman, who he'd treated so poorly just a few months ago, was planning a career in law enforcement because she wanted to make things better. "That's wonderful," he said sincerely. "If you ever want to do a ride-along or learn more about police work, I'd be honored to help." As Henderson drove away that evening, he thought about how much his life had changed since that afternoon on Highway 52. He'd learned that being a good police officer wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing the humanity in every person he encountered and treating them with the dignity they deserved. Most importantly, he'd learned that it's never too late to become a better person.